I really wanted to put the final nail in the coffin of Euthyphro. The fact that this dilemma keeps coming up is honestly just a sign of intellectual laziness as far as I'm concerned.
Hi everybody, my name is Tal, and this is Due Diligence. So I decided I wanted to do a video on the Euthyphro dilemma. I researched a bit, listened to William Lane Craig, Frank Turek, and others, and honestly I think that the most comprehensive response that I found was from this guy Stelman Smith, who has a YouTube channel called The Unapologetic Apologists. So I'll let him explain what the Euthyphro dilemma is.
The Euthyphro dilemma is a response to the argument that God is the best explanation of objective moral values and duties in the universe, meaning that in the absence of God or an external source for morality, then the moral truths we hold are merely subjective, meaning they're just a matter of opinion. So why am I piling on? Haven't the wealth of apologists who have already refuted this dilemma time and time again already killed Euthyphro? The answer is yes, they have, but that hasn't stopped atheists from trying to resurrect Euthyphro, so to speak, and create what I call Euthyphro 2.0. As bad as this dilemma is, you still see the popular level atheists bringing it up. Very recently, Michael Shermer was a guest on Ben Shapiro's Sunday Morning Special, and he brought up the Euthyphro dilemma. But the fact that he brings up this dilemma that's been refuted over and over again, the fact that he's not up to date on the literature, just goes to show you how atheists are currently faring in the intellectual arena. You do realize you're over 100 years out of date on the literature, right?
Sure, maybe atheists are faring really bad in this arena. Maybe Michael Shermer really is 100 years behind on his material. But then again, maybe we just don't find your responses all that convincing. So, what is the Euthyphro dilemma?
So here's the original dilemma. It's found in Plato's dialogue called Euthyphro, where Socrates asks Euthyphro, does God command something because it's good, or something good because God commands it? This is supposed to be a dilemma, because if God commands something just because it's good, then that means there's a standard or a source of morality beyond God to which he's looking to get his rules. In which case, what do you need God for? You can just go right to the source. On the other hand, if something is good just because God commands it, then God is just arbitrary. He just makes up the rules.
This really isn't the original version. In the original version, no one talks of God's commands and of goodness. They speak of piety and that which is dear to the gods. In the original dialogue, Efthyphron, I think, is the way you're supposed to pronounce his name, something like that, answers Socrates' question by saying, piety then is that which is dear to the gods, and impiety is that which is not dear to them. Socrates asks Efthyphron, the point which I should first wish to understand is whether the pious, or holy, is beloved by the gods because it is holy, or holy because it is beloved by the gods. Now this may sound like a subtle difference, and it is. So why would I bring it up? Well, first of all, because I want to show off my amazing general knowledge, of course. But second of all, I mean, it seems unimportant, but it actually is, and you'll see why later. For now, just remember that the version that Stelman offered is not the actual original version.
But I want to take the time in this video to show why the two originally presented options aren't even viable and so can't even create a successful dilemma. The first option, where God looks to a standard of morality beyond himself, isn't even logically coherent. The reason goodness can't just exist out there, some abstract object, is because morality is a property of persons, not things. If there was some Platonic form out there known as the good, to which God is looking to, it would be a person, which is exactly what the atheists are trying to avoid in the first place.
Morality is about persons, not things, but if there is such a thing as objective morality, then it is a property of our reality, or our universe, or the world, or something. It's not a property of things. I personally don't think that there is such a thing as objective morality, and therefore in my worldview, yes, morality is a property of persons, if you want to say it that way. It comes from persons. But if morality is objective, then it is a property of everything, not of individuals.
So even if there was some abstract Platonic form out there known as the good, we would be under no obligation to obey it.
Sure, because there is an abstract good out there, is an is statement, and you can't get an ought from an is, we all know that. But the same is true for God. I mean, there is a God, and God has moral standards. That's still an is statement, not an ought. So what's the difference? I mean, what if we don't like the rules that God makes up?
It doesn't matter if we don't like him. He created us. He's the boss.
He created us, therefore we ought obey him? I mean, he created us, that's an is statement. So, are you getting an ought from an is? Or do you have an embedded ought statement in there that you implicitly assume? Something like, we ought obey that which created us. And if that's the case, where did you get that ought statement from? Surely it couldn't have been God, so why are we under obligation to obey God?
But what about the second option, where God just makes up rules randomly? Let's say it's true that God is just arbitrary and just makes up rules randomly. That's still better than atheism. On atheism, there's no way to get outside of human opinion in an attempt to justify morality. It's just one person's opinion versus another, one society's opinion versus another. At least with an arbitrary God, there's someone outside of humanity making the rules.
And that's a good thing because... what? These rules are about us. Why shouldn't we be the ones to make them? I mean, sure, there is a chance we might get things wrong and we might not get the right rules. But if God is just arbitrary, then the same could be said about him, right? So why would we want something outside of us making the rules for us? Why does Stellman say that apologists have buried Euthyphro a long, long time ago? I think that we can actually find a nice first step to understanding this in a video from Frank Turek.
The problem for the skeptic is this is not a true dilemma. This is what we call a false dilemma. A true dilemma is A or non-A, right? A false dilemma is A or B. Well, maybe there's a C. Maybe there's a third option. And in this case, there is.
There's something ironic in this response, considering how much theists love posing false dilemmas to atheists and to skeptics. But I would say that he's right. I mean, it's true. If a dilemma is phrased as A or B, then there could be a C, D, K, P, Q, whatever. There could be other options. So let's try to see if we can actually phrase this dilemma as A or not A. Here's one option. Would we say that anything is good so long as God commanded it, or not? Let's try it with a more specific thing. If God commanded that we kill transgender people, is killing transgender people a good thing? Or maybe if God commanded that we stone to death women who've had sex outside of wedlock, would that be a good thing? Oh, yeah, sorry. I think you see where I'm getting at, right? So it seems to me that this really is a true dilemma. We can put it as an A or not A, but maybe I'm wrong. Let's see what they offer as a third alternative.
God doesn't look at a standard beyond him and says, that's good, I need to do it. Because if he does that, he's really not God. That thing is God. Okay? And God doesn't arbitrarily make up a standard. God is the standard. That's the third option.
Now, in order for something like this to be a true dilemma, there needs to only be two options. But that's wrong in this case. In this case, there's a third option, which is the answer. God commands something because he is good. God's nature is the standard for morality. God's nature is essentially loving and kind, and it's that which his moral commands stem from.
That is so pathetic. This is such sophistry. It's like, let's just change the word commands it for it's his nature, and it's a whole different thing, right? Wrong. If you actually think that this is a third option, then let me assure you that you are wrong. There is no real significant difference here. And this brings us back to my pettiness from before. I mean, if it really is very important for you, for some reason, to answer the specific question as it was phrased in Plato's dialogue, then sure, this third option isn't one of the options posed there, and the whole question is somewhat different. But if you already took the liberty to rephrase the question in a way that totally preserves its essence, but matches a more modern outlook on morality and deity or divinity, then why not go all the way? Why wouldn't you just say that the dilemma should be phrased as, are these traits of God's nature good because they are parts of his nature, or are they parts of his nature because they are good? We can reimagine Plato's dialogue and have a Euthyphro say, piety then is that which corresponds to God's nature, and impiety is that which does not correspond to it. And then the response from Socrates would be, the point which I should first wish to understand is whether God's nature is pious or holy because it is God's nature, or is it God's nature because it is holy? Okay, we can even frame it again as an A or not A. If God didn't have these traits, would they still be good or not? If God didn't have these traits, would we still say that God is good, or would we not? Or we can take a specific example. If God wasn't loving, would love be good? You see why your third alternative just kicks the can down the road? I mean, you didn't actually add anything to the discussion. You just sort of rephrased it and hope that we will then not ask it again. There's also the obvious problem of God being a murderous, jealous, vindictive character. I mean, if his nature really is the standard for good, then killing others can't be all that bad, right? But let's say that God is loving by nature. What makes this good? I mean, this third option really isn't an option at all. It's still just good because God commands it, because it's dear to the gods, because it's God's nature. It's all the same. It's just different phrasing. If God's nature were different, or if he commanded something else, then that would be the standard for good, right? If God's nature was hateful, then you'd say that hate is good. If God's nature was indifferent, you'd say that indifference is good. If God's nature was dishonest, you get where I'm going with this, right? And Stellman's Euthyphro 2.0 just makes the whole thing even clearer, I think.
But if we claim that God's nature is the standard of morality, atheists say that this just brings up a new dilemma. So here we finally come to Euthyphro 2.0. Is God not in control of his nature? In which case there would seem to be some lack in the power of God because he can't control what attributes constitute his nature. Or is God in control of his nature, which would just go back to making God arbitrary because he can pick any nature he wants, any attributes he wants. Now, this may seem like a clever move on the part of the atheists, but this is the part where I point out that the atheist putting this forth is just demonstrating a deep lack of sophisticated understanding of the concept of God.
And the way that he responds to this Euthyphro 2.0 makes the whole thing even more clear.
Now, when it comes to Euthyphro 2.0, there is no third alternative here. The answer is that God is not in control of his nature.
And that's that. That's God's nature, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. If God's nature was any different, that would be the standard for good. That's the definition of arbitrary. Whether something is bad or good only depends on what God thinks about it. It has nothing to do with what the thing itself is. If there is nothing outside of God that determines what is good and what isn't, then it's just a matter of luck that God's nature doesn't happen to be murderous. Or, it would be if God's nature wasn't murderous, which it obviously is. The fact that thou shalt not kill is in the Ten Commandments just tells us that if God exists, he definitely wasn't banking on us following his nature. But those theists, they don't give up, they just wouldn't quit. They keep insisting that good is not arbitrary.
His commands necessarily reflect his moral nature. Therefore, they are not arbitrary. When the atheist demands, if God were to command child abuse, would we be obligated to abuse our children? He's asking a question like, if there were a square circle, would its area be the square of one of its sides? There is no meaningful answer because what it supposes is logically incoherent.
William Lane Craig claims that the idea of God commanding child abuse is as logically incoherent as a square circle. And I think that he's wrong. I think that he's dead wrong. But I have to say that trying to find the best way to explain it was challenging for me. So I'll give it my best shot, but if you think that this explanation is really not good enough, that it's not clear, that it leaves open more questions, then comment down below and I promise that I'll try to find a way to explain it differently. Maybe I'll even have to make a separate video just about this. But here's the best that I got until now. So let's say part of the reason why a square circle is logically incoherent is that a square, by definition, has 4 sides, right? And a circle, by definition, has no sides. Now, these two statements are true irrespective of one another. A square has 4 sides, and that's true irrespective of what a circle is. And a circle has no sides, and that's true irrespective of what a square is. And the fact that these two statements, has 4 sides and has no sides, can't be part of one object is the thing that makes the concept self-contradictory. You could, of course, say something similar in the context of God and commanding child abuse. It would be something like, God will not command something that is evil. Child abuse is evil. Therefore, we can say that God commands child abuse. It's incoherent. Sure. But the key difference is that here these statements don't stand on their own. Well, the first one maybe does. Maybe we could say that God will not command something that is evil, and that's irrespective of what child abuse is. They can say that child abuse is evil without putting God into the equation, right? I mean, here this whole definition becomes somewhat circular, which is not the case, ironically, with the circle and the square. So to me, that's a major difference, because these two statements, again, are not true on their own. Stellman offers another explanation that tries to make sense of this idea that good is not arbitrary.
God, by definition, is infinite in every metaphysical attribute that has positive ontological status. A metaphysical attribute it's exactly what you would assume. It's an attribute that isn't physical. Now, in order for these metaphysical attributes to be possessed by God, they have to have positive ontological status, which just means that they have to actually exist. To give an analogy, cold doesn't actually exist. It has no positive ontological status. There is no thing called cold. Now, there is a thing called heat. Heat has positive ontological status. Heat actually exists. And cold is a lack or an absence of heat. Evil is real, and we experience it. But it can't exist on its own. It can only exist as a privation of a good thing. The mistake that Euthyphro 2.0 makes is that it assumes that goodness and evil are on a par ontologically with one another, and that God just randomly or otherwise possesses one and not the other. But the fact is, evil doesn't actually exist like goodness does. So evil doesn't have any positive ontological status, but goodness does. And so by definition, God exemplifies goodness to its maximum.
I must say that I really like this explanation. There's something about it that just feels right. Just like heat really does exist, but cold only exists as its absence. Good really does exist, and evil only exists as its absence. It really feels right. Now, can you just prove that it's also true? These days, when we understand enough about thermal energy, we know that cold is nothing more than the privation of heat. Can you really say the same about evil? I mean, maybe evil is the thing that has positive ontological status, and good is the privation of that? So, first of all, prove that. And when you do, then go ahead and prove that a God that is infinite in every metaphysical attribute that has positive ontological status actually exists. But even if you do prove both these things, even if you prove that good has its positive ontological status and that there is a God who therefore exemplifies this good to its maximum, that still doesn't actually get you out of the dilemma. I mean, the question still remains. We don't actually know what makes the good good. Let me try to explain this by again reimagining the dialogue between Socrates and Euthyphro. Euthyphro says, "Piety then is that which corresponds to God's nature, and impiety is that which does not." God's nature is infinite in all metaphysical attributes that have positive ontological status. To which Socrates responds, "The point which I should first wish to understand is whether the pious or holy has positive ontological status because it is holy, or is it holy because it has positive ontological status?" And I think now would probably be a good time to end this video. If you felt that the explanations here were a bit too complicated, then I'm really sorry. I just feel that in light of all the mental gymnastics that apologists go through in order to avoid this dilemma, I really didn't have a choice. I had to respond to their arguments, sort of. If you still feel that I didn't do a good enough job, then, comment down below. Ask your question and I'll try to clarify. And as many before me have already said, and many after still will, don't forget to like and subscribe. My normal sign-off might sound a bit weird after such a complicated video, but I think it still sort of makes sense. Think about it. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the world is complex, but it doesn't have to be complicated. Have a good one.